Welcome, everybody. This is a NEHA series featuring disclosure management. And I am pleased to be joined here by Brent Baina, who is CEO and founder of Apogee Process Improvement. So a little introduction to Brent. Before becoming the CEO and founding Apogee, he was the managing director and control officer executive at JP Morgan Chase. He's had positions at First Niagara, National City Bank, and has even written a book, Activity-Based Management for Financial Institutions, co-authored 4 patents, and holds an MBA from Columbia Business School. So, Brent, that is quite a record of accomplishment. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Very happy to join you today, Brent. It's the meeting of the Brents, I guess.
That's right. Not too often that I get to talk to another Brent, so that's always a pleasure for me.
Same here.
All right. Well, let's get into it, because really, I don't think that there's anybody who's really more of an expert around disclosures, and I think that's what really excites me about this conversation, is to really learn from your experience working at these banks, and then also with Apogee. Do you want to give a quick plug as to who Apogee is and kind of what you do today? Because I think our audience would love to kind of hear a little bit more about your work.
Sure. After spending the last 4 or 5 years roughly of my time at the U.S.'s largest bank, fixing disclosures, and that was the 2 words I was given for a mandate: go fix disclosures. We decided, me and some of the other folks that have joined Apogee, that this is not a problem at one bank. This is a problem in the banking industry. And when I say problem, I mean the ability to trace, maintain disclosures. And the symptom, unfortunately, is a lot of large fines from various regulators, particularly over the last 10 years.
Yeah. Which I think that leads into my first question about disclosures is, I mean, if you're working at a bank, you're a marketer, you're a product manager, why do you care about disclosures? What's the issue at stake?
Yeah, great question. I think there are billions of reasons, not to quote Carl Sagan, I guess, billions of reasons to care about disclosures. In the first 10 years of its existence, for example, the CFPB, which was founded in 2010, really took a hard look at disclosures and consumer-facing language and actions. And the first 10 years of its existence, they levied about $13 billion in fines. Now, not all of that was disclosures, but many of them were disclosure related. Either banks weren't doing what they said they were doing, or they weren't saying what they were doing, right? Which are 2 forms of disclosures. So it's just been interesting since their inception. You've got a situation where banks have, I think the last I looked, there are maybe 13 regulators, that kind of look at banks, everything from DOJ with banking specific things all the way through the CFPB. Previously, the regulators didn't really ask for consumer feedback the way that the CFPB did. And so in 2015, when they first published some of their feedback from consumers, it was a little jaw-dropping. And I think the other regulators have taken notice and said, okay, if we're here to help protect the consumer, we've got to listen to the consumer more. And in listening to the consumer more, you've seen more regulatory actions on banks and other financial institutions.
Yeah. I mean, I can definitely see that. And that drives a number of different issues. So, I know you had talked about fines are continually going up. That there's more scrutiny. What's driving more fines these days than say 4 or 5 years ago even?
Yeah, it's a combination of the regulators recently, when you say 4 or 5 years, the regulators and their focus on the consumer. But it really, as bizarre as this sounds, this situation really started about more than 100 years ago, when the first banking regulator put out the first regulations. So the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, that started just a handful of regulations. And it was pretty easy. At that point, you had one channel, you had paper, you had one regulator at the time. So it was a fairly easy situation. And then over the years, the one regulator turned to, like I said, 13, or let's call it a dozen, just for easy math, right? A dozen-ish regulators. The channels went from paper to paper and radio and television and internet and mobile. ATM screens came into existence over that time. So there were just a lot of advancements in channel, and then there were a lot of advancements in products. The products over 100 years ago were basically a checking and a savings, and now you've got so many different channels. So many different products. The product channel regulator regulation combination didn't happen overnight, but over that course of time, now you end up with this sort of unwieldy disclosure environment at most financial institutions.
Oh, absolutely. No, I can see that. I mean, just the complexity of the products, the complexity of the channels, and then even speaking of channels, the addition of really the interactive abilities. I mean, I think between mobile and social, we're talking about regulating both static content and dynamic content, which is just a new challenge.
Right, and there was very little. I'll say dynamic content, think even 25 years ago, dynamic content basically meant you were talking face to face with somebody, or maybe you were on the phone with somebody. But now it can be a chat session, a social media sort of situation. It's expanded a lot over the years.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I would imagine that with the addition of new products, I mean, I think that I think you had talked about, like, in 2008, with the financial crisis that brought on a whole slew of new regulations. And we see now some of the same markers, I think, within the stock market. Do you see kind of some parallels between 2008 to 2022 and kind of where these regulations are going?
Yeah, I do think that in the financial services industry, right, you have these hot topics that come and I'm not going to say they go, but they show up because of the times, if nothing else, right? So as you look right now, one of the hot buttons is environmental, social, and governance type disclosures, or ESG disclosures. So you see more governance about that. We've seen our first fine to Bank of New York Mellon. So that on ESG disclosures. So that kind of stuff is heating up, and it is very common, I should say, for the regulations to lag the technology and the product offerings a bit. They're generally not ahead of it. You have to create that product or that channel for them to understand it a little bit to regulate it. That's happened across the board.
Oh, absolutely. So kind of switching gears a little bit, I guess, historically, why are disclosures so hard to manage for banks? I mean, where's the challenge internally to be able to do this type of program effectively?
Yeah, I think internally, disclosures suffer from a variety of things. One is they're not centralized. They're not centrally managed generally. The part that comes with that is they are not rationalized. So, and let me share with you an example of what I mean by rationalized. So if you have disclosures in this particular example, there are disclosures related to FINRA 2212, SEC 482. This is a part of the obligations related there. We've all seen this little phrase over in the yellow box on the right: past performance is no guarantee of future results. The reason you say that is that you have FINRA 2212, SEC 482 that are the obligations behind it. At a bank, you may see 10 different versions in this particular example of what you're trying to fulfill. FINRA 2212, SEC 482, that's shown on the left. You can see some of them are very close to past performance is no guarantee of future results. One of them is past performance is no guarantee of future returns. One of them is past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Well, some of them get a little further off the single source of truth, as we like to call it, on the right. Like, past performance is not indicative of future results. Well, then it becomes a little dangerous. I would contend that past performance is indicative. I'm no lawyer myself, but there's a big difference between something not being an indicator and something not being guaranteed. Mm-hmm. So when you have these variations that you see on the left on the screen, if they're unintentional and variations, it really is just introducing risk to the bank. So that's one of the problems, are these it's not centralized, the variations haven't been taken down. What you see on this screen is something that's generally missing at banks as well, which is, what's the traceability? Why am I saying those words? Tell me what laws, regs, or rules, and that's the world we live in, laws, regs, and rules, are giving me the obligation to communicate those words to my customer. And that's also a big miss at banks in their environments right now, because it's grown up over 100 years, right? It has taken very long to get in this quagmire that we're in right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a topic worth lingering on, because I think this is the cornerstone of traceability. I think is like what you said, the laws, the reg, the rules, and being able to tie that language. And I think you had even mentioned, a lot of those, a lot of the regulations will give you the specific language. They give you the answer, right? That you're looking for.
That's true. So in many cases, particularly lately, the CFPB has actually been very good at providing model language. And so we view that as, while it's not, they don't say you won't get in trouble if you use this language. They're in essence saying this language is acceptable, right? So why would you use any other language other than what they're recommending, right? You'd have to have a very strong reason not to use the words that have been, in essence, pre-approved, right? So we look at it as safe harbor language. We also analyze the disclosures to understand, and we have our reference database that we go in with it. Is this completely safe harbor language? Is there no safe harbor language in this disclosure that we can find, or is it a partial situation? If it's complete, just use what they're asking you to use.
Exactly. I think in the example that you gave, what comes to mind is, when my kids play the game of telephone.
Yeah, right.
And it sounds like, where it starts off as, past performance is no guarantee of future returns, through the telephone turns into indicators.
Right. Yeah, things get wordsmithed over the years. It's exactly right. As I pass it to you, as I retire or change jobs, and you take over, and you say, well, I don't really like that phrasing, and you may not understand why I chose the phrasing that I chose, right? You may not understand that that's required language, and that happens as well.
Right. it, so again, it kind of goes back to why are disclosures so hard to manage? It just the multiple owners. I think the sort of the multiple places that these disclosures are managed, and really just adds to a little bit of that is an evolution of or a telephone game that just is not doesn't work.
Yeah, I can summarize it by saying most banks don't know what they say in total. They don't know why they say it because it's not linked to laws, regs, or rules, and they don't know where they say it.
Right, right. So, so kind of going back, I think, and I think you touched on this just a little bit, I guess, but to kind of summarize the top five things, I guess, if you were to list those out of kind of the banks, like, hey, you get this wrong, right? Like what you're doing wrong with disclosures. What do you usually kind of say is your top five?
Yeah, the first one I would say is that you don't have a definition of what a disclosure is. And we call that using the lowercase d disclosures. Anything I tell you is a disclosure. In our world, a disclosure is content that's required to be communicated by law, reg, or rule. It's very specific. There are also no standards, right? So I would throw the no definition and no standards into one bucket. There's limited ownership at most financial institutions of the disclosure. Oftentimes, people will try to say that compliance owns a disclosure, and the regulators have been fairly clear in saying that the compliance is not the owner. They are not the first line of defense. It has to be the business that owns the disclosures. Third thing is they're not linked to those laws, regs, and rules. So once again, you don't know why you're saying it, right? So those laws, regs, rules have what we call obligations. That's why you're making the communication. And what you brought up a little earlier, Brent, was the traceability. I mean, broadly, the lack of traceability, particularly then out to their communications. And if any of the viewers of this webcast had to live through the LIBOR language changes, right? That should be relatively fresh in their heads. To be able to find where you were using the term LIBOR, which is a disclaimer, not a disclosure, but it follows a similar pattern. If you had to go look at all your contracts and all your various spots that you may use the word LIBOR, I know banks where it was a 6-month effort to find that language. If you have traceability, that should be minutes, not months. So it's fundamental that you have traceability from a operational execution end and a maintenance end. It's just lacking in most places. And then the last one, I would say of the sort of top five, is banks generally are not paying attention to the customer complaints related to disclosures. They're not categorized in a special way. So banks, particularly good banks who now have a common collection spot, are not breaking out disclosures to realize that risk that's laying there, because for every dissatisfied customer with a disclosure issue, if somebody is going to bring that to the attention of the regulators, and then you've got a real financial problem on your hands.
Okay. I want to come back to that last point, because I think we'll come back to that. But I'd love to go back to that LIBOR example, because I think some banks just think, yeah, well, I could just like I've got the tools in place. I can search my content. I can search my digital asset management system for LIBOR. Well, like talk to me a little bit, I guess, why that simplistic solution is just impractical in the real world.
Yeah. So I'll tell you specifically more on the LIBOR example and pull that thread a little bit more, and then more broadly speaking, right? So I know one of the issues with the LIBOR language itself is, do you look for the word LIBOR if you're doing a keyword search? Do you look for London interbank offer rate? And then it became clear that those seemed very simple, but every once in a while what was going on was people were describing the London Interbank Offer Rate, LIBOR rate, without actually using the term LIBOR or London or interbank. It was just, they described a rate that just happened to be LIBOR. So it gets tricky even with AI search capabilities to track that stuff down. And then also depending on the medium that the communication is conveyed in. So is it a PDF, is it a Word document, is it all stored in a way that's easily searchable? Sometimes they're embedded in systems. So you think you have this great content management library, not realizing that some of these systems are auto-generating communications and they're not inventoried. So
Right, right. Which kind of goes back to the your main point, right? These are not centrally managed. They're spread across the organization and multiple versions of that language.
yeah, in the example that I showed earlier with the variations to the one single source of truth, you'd have to be able to find all 10 of those versions. So if you were looking, let's say you thought guarantee was the word you really wanted to look for, but yet some of the versions are using the word indicative.
Mhm.
Personally, I wouldn't have even looked for the word indicative, except for the fact that me and my team, we have experience with this now and know that sometimes it's phrased that way.
Well, right, right. Yeah, I mean, how would you know, if you're the compliance officer managing that change, because of a reg change, that your product manager happened to use indicative,
Right.
versus the guarantee. That's yeah, a very difficult problem. So so going back to, I think, the customer complaint side of the house, because I think this is really, you know I hear, if the marketers or the lay people, and like, oh, disclosures, it's the fine print, it's the legalese, right? But at the end of the day, there's a business benefit to being upfront with your customers, setting those expectations. Talk to me a little bit about kind of what's, you know, beyond just risk mitigation. How
Right.
does it benefit the bank to have a really good program around this?
Yeah, I think there are three main benefits with this. So let me share another screen with you. So I think when you have a world-class disclosure operation, you end up seeing three main benefits. And it always starts with the customer. You should think about that first. So as we described customer pain points, you'll have an improved customer experience. Now, the Apogee team has seen that and has helped to reduce disclosure-related complaints 74% within 1 year at one of our major installations, basically our major
Amazing statistic. Yeah.
implementations, right? Additionally, we've talked on the bottom right there about the reduced regulatory exposure. I mean, these days, it's amazing. If you get a $10 million fine, you almost feel lucky. You and I were speaking earlier this week, and I told you about a bank that got a fine in 2018. The very first paragraph was talking about incorrect disclosures. That was the main reason they got the fine. It was very clear it was a disclosure fine. And when I happened to be speaking with the chief risk officer and asking about the disclosures, he couldn't recall having a disclosure fine in recent history. So it's interesting how and that was 4 years ago. Now, granted, I get it was a while ago, and we all had COVID in there, which makes life seem, that much longer. But $15 million fine, forgetting a $15 million fine is interesting. 20 years ago, nobody would have forgot a $15 million fine. That was sort of a really high-end fine. Now, banks are getting fined hundreds of millions of dollars at times. And so the exposure is that much greater. And then the final one is this operational efficiency that we just touched on a little earlier, right? Being able to not only change disclosures quickly in an add or change environment when a regulator decides to change a law, rule, or reg, but also in day-to-day updates of servicing letters or communications. If you have pre-approved content with disclosures that don't have to be re-reviewed, you have less legal time in review of these documents. You have less operational time trying to wordsmith a particular paragraph. And what we saw based on our statistics is about and this was at a large bank, about a $20,000 or 20,000 hour annual benefit between legal compliance and operations in not re-reviewing pre-approved language. So 3 major benefits.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what strikes me on this is that these are compounding benefits or compounding risks, right? Because one is you have a disclosure to be able to set proper expectations with your customers, which is just a good thing in of itself, so that you have fewer customer complaints. But I think of without it, you get more customer complaints, which gets registered by the CFPB. And then on top of that, that makes you more of a target to get audited, which then increases your cost, which then increases your, a potential fine.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned before, that's only a drop in the bucket when it comes to your total cost.
Yeah, that's true. So I don't know if I know you and I have talked about this before, but I think this is the first time we're bringing it up in this particular conversation. There was a client that we had talked to, and they said, "Hey, my fine." This was a smaller bank. They said, "Hey, my fine was basically 1/3 of my actual costs." So they were fined multi-million dollars. And the way that it was, the chief operating officer said, "I think our actual cost was really 3x that, because we spent an equivalent amount as the fine, trying to argue that we shouldn't get the fine. So we had legal costs, we had compliance costs. So all that upfront piece, all the data that we pulled together to say, we were better than the regulator thought. In the end, we really weren't, and we got fined what we got fined. So that was 1/3. Another third was the fine, and then actually remediating the fine and going after the corrections operationally cost them another third. So while a bank might get a $10 million fine, its actual impact could be $30 million.
And and now you're talking about a real cost, to the bank. That's
it's a distraction too. Think about the opportunity cost of having that many people try to resolve something when they could be working on the next product, or improving customer service, or on and on and on. So rather than getting better, you're just trying to catch up, in essence.
That's right. That's right. I think that's real motivation, I think, to taking a closer look at your disclosure process and what you can do to improve that. So we hit on a little bit of this, which I think you talked about, like the environmental, social, and governance. But I'm kind of curious as to what you see as like the future of the regulators and in the disclosures, how they're going to keep up with the latest fintech products, but and then also the latest movements like environmental. What do you kind of see as the forecast?
Yeah, as we talked about a little bit, the laws and the rules and the regs, they generally follow the advancements on products and channels and just I'll say the overall financial environment, right? So if I had to answer this question 10 years ago, I would have been wrong. So although, you can get a little bit of a forecast maybe in the next couple of years. So I can tell you in the next couple of years, we're certainly going to see more ESG related fines and disclosures. I mean, they kind of go hand in hand. So, this is what we mean by environmental, social, and governance disclosures, right? The SEC is sort of wrapping up their first draft of this, and we'll put it out for commentary period for a couple of months. I don't really know when they plan to implement it, but these are the types of things that are taking a front seat right now. There will certainly be more when you look to other areas of impact, Brent. It's think about customer pain points, right? So Rohit Chopra, the current head of the CFPB, they're cracking down on debt collection practices. So while we certainly have the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, CDCPA, easily rolls off the tongue. Things like that will be enhanced over the years, is what I would see. And there will be more protections that you have to communicate.
Right.
When we started this conversation off and we said something about, and I think you brought up the 2008 crisis and the regulations that came in for consumer protections after that crisis. You have even saying the mortgage servicer number you have to give the ID, right? And you didn't have to do that beforehand. So it's little things, it's big things, it's things you may not have thought of as protection before, but that's the way our legal system works. That's the way our regulatory system works. So expect more regulation, not less. I will guarantee that.
I would say that that might be in Mark Twain's guarantees of life.
Exactly.
Death, taxes, and more regulations for banks.
More regulation. Yes, yeah, I agree.
I love it. So let's just talk about maybe kind of what a bank can do. If they're looking at kind of the disclosures, they know they've got kind of this issue of just too many cooks in the kitchen and too many places where these disclosures are being managed. What are your recommendations when you walk into a bank that's just kind of faced with this operational challenge?
Yeah, I think the scariest part for any bank, and I'll say that personally, because the scariest part for a bank or an individual is for somebody to tap you on the shoulder and say, fix disclosures, the two words I was given. It's terrifying because where to begin is really the daunting part, and how to begin, right? The old proverb of, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, right? You got to get moving on something, right? I would tell you that it's a matter of, let's capture what your issues and opportunities are as a bank. What kind of fines have you seen? What have been your audit findings? What are your customers saying? Let's get a good feel for what this environment is. So an assessment of your current situation is number one, right? Somebody says you have a disclosure problem. Well, wouldn't you want to actually quantify what that is and understand what the environment is? So that's step one. See how keep this in mind, right? How do your disclosures fit with your overall goal of content management for your company? Where are you headed from a content perspective, how does this fit in here? I would contend that disclosures may be your most important piece of content. And so if you're going to help drive a content management system and demonstrate the value of it, disclosures can be that linchpin. Signatures are nice, logos are nice, artwork is nice, but disclosures are required. So that's the part that may give you some push on that. The other piece that's big here is prioritize your efforts. This is a risk-based approach to disclosures. Where people are getting fines right now are not at, a state level too much. It's U.S. federal disclosures. And there are a subset of all the obligations. A bank has literally, as a bank and just a general business, you have tens of thousands of obligations because of different regulations, regulators, right? There is a subset of those that are very important, that are disclosure related. I will tell you that that number is around 5% that are disclosure related. So you have a lot of things that your board of directors has to do. Great, super, that's not a disclosure. You have non-customer facing disclosures that you have to tell the regulator. Super, most places that's not really an issue either. But customer facing disclosures, US federal customer facing disclosures are a big deal. And then I'll tell you the second to last thing to do is get started. Now, I will say how you get started matters a little bit too, because in a been there, done that situation, if you don't know how to approach this, and we've talked about a couple of ways, it is very much like walking into a pitch black room that you've never been in before and try to navigate your way through that room. You will constantly bump into furniture along the way. You will bruise your shins. Hopefully you won't fall down, but it will be that painful experience of trying to navigate a dark room. There are folks like Nahas, folks like Apogee that can help you navigate that room, help you turn the lights on, help you avoid the pitfalls before you go bouncing into those things. So I would say those are the big pieces of advice that I have for any bank that wants to resolve this.
Yeah, I love it. I think your first piece of advice just kind of caught my attention, because I think it's a holistic look of disclosures, and to me, and again, it kind of goes back to why are we doing disclosures? Well, it's to communicate to customers and set expectations, and and have this meaningful partnership with your customers. And so it should start there, right? It should start with what are you hearing from your customer complaints, and can we do a better job of communicating that, or communicating our product set to these customers, and then looking at it from the regulators and sort of internally, and sort of that but we all know it drives from the customers.
Yeah, I mean, disclosures they're a very interesting piece to me, and I hope to others as well. I mean, there are things that you want your customer to know, so much so that the regulators have said, we require your customers to know these things. So it is all about the customer.
Yeah. So I'm always a firm believer in process, people, technology kind of framework. When we talk about the process, in terms of people, who should if I know in like the larger banks, there's probably dedicated teams to some of these areas, and they can throw a lot more money at it. For the regional banks, the smaller banks, who should own this? Is this a marketing? Is this a product? Is this a compliance? Because everybody seems to have a hand in this.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I would say for your smaller bank, well, for any bank, you have no less than 4 or 5 major stakeholders in this, right? The chief compliance officer should care because this is a compliance issue. Let's start there, right? Your chief risk officer should care. This is a big risk. Your chief operating officer should care. The servicing letters, the servicing communications, if those aren't right, and there are a lot of disclosures on those, that's where, everything comes to roost, is whoever has the issue. Your CMO, the chief marketing officer, should care. There are a lot of disclosures on marketing. So the people that are trying to communicate, the COO, the CMO, the people who care about compliance and risk, the chief compliance officer and the chief risk officer. And then the fifth person is actually your chief control officer, because not having this environment in place demonstrates a lack of control. And a lack of control is a problem the regulators will just not let go of. And they shouldn't.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess the last point, right? Technology. Do you see kind of, there's been huge advancements, I think, in reg tech, over the last few years, and AI has certainly streamlined a lot of these processes. Talk to me about kind of what you see in the technology side of things that kind of gets you excited.
Yeah, I think there's a great convergence of technology in different spots. AI is very useful in being able to find where the disclosures are. It's not perfect, but it's certainly, as you have it, not only AI, but the machine learning aspect of AI. I think that's very important to find where you may have the issues. You've got great tools, NAHAS being one of them, that are able to take the single source of truth and get it linked to the customer communications. And so it's tracking the customer communications, and you've got that logging. So it is much easier now with a tool like that to say, where am I communicating? Past performance is no guarantee of future results, right? You'll have an inventory that is always, it's not a matter of refreshing it, it's never out of date. So there are different components along the way that help the situation, and you may need several of them to have a full, holistic solution for disclosures in a particular environment.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great point, and a great way to, I think, end our conversation. Brent, I can't thank you enough for your time. Obviously, I can see why you achieve such great results for your clients. The results that you showed earlier, and so I want to extend a heartfelt thanks for taking this time to talk with us about your experience with disclosures. For everyone out there, we have, I think that, Brent with Apogee Process Improvement, fantastic consulting firm. Is that the best way to describe yourself, Brent?
That's it, yeah. And by the way, I thank you very much for having me on today. It was fantastic. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, as it is my pleasure indeed. Yeah. So we will have links to contact information, and for more information, we'll have the websites down below. Please feel free to reach out to Apogee or NAHAS to learn more about what we can do around helping you with your disclosure process and tools that can make it just a little bit easier to kind of get a handle on this.
Thanks, Brent. Take care.
Thank you, Brent. Cheers.